Chapter 2. A Turn of Events. Mulder began coughing in earnest before his mind re-established just where he was. Hospital, he said, perplexed. But he'd just been on that alien ship, hadn't he? Tears started to prick at the corners of his eyes and he sniffed before letting out a shuddering breath. Holy hell! Surely that was no memory he'd just experienced. It was almost like he'd been returned to that moment in time through no choice of his own. Don't, he stammered. Don't take me back there. As he spoke the words, his hand automatically opened his gown and began to trace trembling fingers down his chest. He felt the scarred tissue forming one long line down his torso and froze. Oh, God! The blackness enveloped him and there was nothing he could do to prevent it from happening. It was like they wanted him to relive this close encounter in his head. But these goddamn alien beings had been far from gentle and sweet like Spielberg's movie. No, it was more like a sick and twisted Stephen King novel. Or maybe Clive Barker. Yes, Hellraiser would be much more accurate to describe what he went through. What he was going through. Mulder felt the cold on his back and, opening his eyes, realised he was lying down in some sort of metallic contraption, slightly tilting on its frame. Like a chair, only this was no comfy sofa he was strapped to. There was also a sharp throbbing ache in his limbs. Becoming aware that both his wrists and ankles were bolted to the object, piercing through flesh and bone, his breathing quickened and his chest heaved as he tried to make sense of what was happening to him. Christ! Then he felt a tugging pain in his cheeks and understood his face was on the verge of being ripped apart with metal hooks. What was that about Hellraiser? Was fucking Pinhead and his minions going to sentence him to an eternal damnation in the netherworld? No, he could say with complete and utter conviction that he was definitely already there. A screeching, tearing sound almost burst his eardrums. Then he noticed two metal prongs moving towards him, which pushed into both nostrils as a drill on a robotic arm proceeded to tear into the roof of his mouth. In the blink of an eye, he was witnessing another of these appendages, with a small saw attached, usually used for autopsies, now slicing into his chest. Blood sprayed everywhere as he felt an agonizing scream rip from his lungs and fill the air, drowning out the noise of these sadistic instruments. Mulder jumped with a start, then recognised a loud beeping which was coming from a monitor that he was hooked up to. At first glance he could see the ECG reading was going off the charts. His heart felt like a winged insect beating itself against his ribcage. The palpitations were so rapid he thought he was going to go into a cardiac arrest, so he forced himself to take slow, deliberate breaths, which helped steady him, automatically causing the green waves on the monitor to do the same, and return the electronic blips to a normal rhythm. So he was back in the chair, the hospital chair, that is. He breathed a sigh of relief, then hoped and prayed he would remain there this time. Please let these bloody nightmares just stop, he begged. Undoubtedly that's what they must have been, just delusions, right? If that was so, then why had they not ceased? He remembered results from a recent thorough examination which had miraculously revealed he was in fact driving in the fast lane on the road to recovery, with no trace of any neurological disorder or even alien virus remaining in his system. It was his FBI partner taking on the role of his physician, and a Dr. Lim who'd revealed this news to him, which should have been a great relief. So why did he still find himself grappling with these extremely vivid hallucinations? Okay, concentrate on memories of events that only occurred on planet Earth, he told himself sternly. Taking a deep breath, he allowed himself to hearken back to the day in his apartment in Higal Place after he'd been discharged from the hospital. His partner Dana Scully had cleaned it for him, which she really needn't have done. He'd wandered around aimlessly, checking out the rest of his belongings, whilst she had tried in vain to make him feel at ease. Realising he no longer had one of his fish in the aquarium, she'd explained how one of his mollies hadn't been as lucky as him. Lucky! That was one wording he could never relate to under the circumstances. Lost in his own jumbled-up thoughts, he realised he hadn't even fully registered the poor woman was heavily pregnant. Even when he had acknowledged that, he just couldn't let his heart fully comprehend the revelation. He'd even apologised for sounding so cold when he told her how happy she must have felt about the fact she was with child. something she desperately wanted, even though her womb had been made barren since her own abduction in the past. So that had been a damn miracle in itself, but he seriously hadn't been able to process anything he was being faced with. He'd even tried throwing himself back into the work he'd left behind, pursuing an incident he believed was an X-file, and maybe an answer to why he himself had been taken by the aliens. Against the Bureau's wishes, he'd assigned himself on a case involving a shooting outside the White House, some nutjob who thought he was a prophet, and the abduction of Scully's new FBI partner she'd been assigned with whilst he'd been missing, a John Doggett. Boy, he really didn't like that guy. They'd ended up at the Federal Statistics Center in Virginia, where he'd believed the man had set him up while he was attempting to transmit data using the password from a disk discovered on a man named Howard Salt, who worked for the US Census Bureau, the same guy who'd been shot on the White House lawn and who he believed to have been a multiple alien abductee. Even though Doggett had given him the code through Scully so he could access the database, which he'd understood would reveal all the names of the people chosen to be replaced by alien facsimiles, because they had a certain genetic profile, he still didn't fully trust him and never would. This had been prevented when the lone gunman had tried in vain to upload the emails he had attempted to send to every national newspaper in the country with the files attached. Then when a group of armed soldiers had descended, his paranoid friends had luckily solved a way of escape through a loose panel in the ceiling. Of course, no conclusions had been drawn regarding alien involvement, so once again he'd been left wondering why he'd been selected as a guinea pig for the Greys. Echoes of past events continued flooding into Mulder's mind, swirling around in his head like a cyclone. Toto, you're not in Kansas anymore. The mental image he was now perceiving was a flying house landing in a mystical land. He could even hear the familiar strains from the MGM musical, If Happy Little Bluebirds Fly, Then Why, oh why can't I? Without any warning, a shrill sound snapped him out of his reverie, causing his eyes to dart open. It took a few shaky seconds before he realised it was in fact the ringtone on his phone. He also discovered he was lying on his couch in his apartment. Saved by the Bell, he said, still dazed. Hang on a minute. Hadn't he just been in a hospital? Just another dream, like all the rest, he thought. But this had seemed much more intense and so real. Slowly getting to his feet, he walked across the room, heaved a weary sigh, and picked up the receiver. Hello? Mulder, it's me. Hearing her ever-familiar catchphrase was kind of comforting and allowed a faint smile to appear on his lips. Scully? Her name remained suspended in mid-air, as he really didn't know what else to say. He heard her reply, and it was clear she was worried about him. Mulder, I'm coming over. No excuses. Then the phone went dead. For a good while he just stared blankly at the receiver in his hand before placing it back into its cradle. He went into the kitchen to get a glass out of the cupboard, but as he held it under the tap in the sink, he noticed his hand was shaking. Quickly he drank the water, then returned to the couch and seated himself. Just how long could he carry on like this? Thoughts of the latest case he'd forced himself to partake in began to take shape. The words, fight the future, echoed in his mind, and in that instant images formed of alien duplicates surrounding him in the darkness which made him shiver. Since returning from his abduction, Mulder had never once spoken about that frightening ordeal to anyone. Not even to the woman he'd once admitted was his constant, his touchstone. Well, it was a very personal matter, so he hadn't felt like sharing it. She respectfully had never asked him to, and so he'd buried it deep within himself. But lately he seemed to be losing the willpower to stop these nightmares from haunting him. It was becoming more and more impossible to keep them at bay, especially with an eidetic memory. During many a restless night he found himself slipping down into an abyss that he couldn't escape from, where he found himself reliving every single terrifying moment aboard the alien craft. Maybe he should talk to someone before these visions completely destroyed whatever sanity he had left. Perhaps it was finally time to reveal the truth to Scully.